Good morning. All right, I have in my pocket here, who can tell me what this is right here? A piece of paper, right. Now, what's the difference between this and this? All right, one is green, right, and the other one's not green. But actually, this is a representation of the fruit of someone's labor, right? Or at least a portion of the fruit of someone's labor. Hopefully, our labor is worth a little bit more than that. But let me ask you another question. How many of these does it take for a person to be considered rich or wealthy? I read a survey where the majority of the people said that in order to be considered rich or wealthy, you need to have 1 to 5 million in assets. And if you have 1 to 5 million in assets, then you would be considered rich or wealthy. What's interesting is that 55% of people that do have 1 to 5 million in assets, 55% of those people don't consider themselves rich or wealthy. Seems like a lot of people that some people would consider rich or wealthy don't consider themselves rich or wealthy. It's always somebody else that makes a little bit more than you, then they're the ones that are rich and wealthy. But think about something. Think about the average American and compare it to people in other parts of the world. Because I've been to other parts of the world, and you go to other parts of the world and they consider every American rich, every American wealthy. I remember I knew a man several years ago who said, I'm not wealthy. People think I'm wealthy and I'm rich. And people look, and he lives in one of the nicest houses in town. All his cars are brand new, top of the line, and clothes are all brand name. And people look at him and considers himself wealthy. But I'm not wealthy, but depends on where you're at. And the majority of the rest of the world, when they look at us, would say that the majority of us are wealthy. There was a man by the name of Robert Hellbroner who did an exercise to give a little perspective on our blessings. He said, do this: take away all of your furniture except for one table and a couple of chairs, and get rid of all of your beds, and the only thing you'll have for beds is a couple of blankets. Get rid of all of your clothing except your oldest dress or your oldest suit, and leave only one pair of shoes. Empty your pantry of all things except for a small bag of flour, some sugar, a little bit of salt, a few potatoes, some onions, and a dish of dried beans. Get rid of your bathroom, shut off all the water, remove all electrical wiring, and place your house in the middle of a shanty town. Cancel all of your subscriptions for magazines, newspapers, and everything else, because now you can't read anyway. Leave only one radio for the entire shanty town, and move the nearest hospital or clinic 10 miles away, and put the person in charge of that clinic, make that person a midwife rather than a doctor. Oh, and also throw away all of your bank books, your retirement, your insurance, and all of those sorts of things, and only leave the family a hoard of about $10. And you can give the head of the household a few acres of land to cultivate, to make a little bit of cash crops. 1/3 of that would go to the landlord and 1/10 to the money lenders. Oh, and lop off about 20 years of your life expectancy. So if you do all that, you get an idea of the way a lot of people in other parts of the world live. And this wasn't to shame us, but to give us a little perspective on how blessed we are, especially when we begin to complain about various things. The Bible affirms that if you work hard and under the right conditions and the right opportunities, you become successful financially. The Bible actually affirms that. Wealth in itself is not inherently evil. In fact, those who are wealthy have often been a great blessing to those who have less. And the Bible has some principles and instructions concerning wealth. And so the topic this morning is making the most of your money. And we'll start with just a pretty obvious point. The first principle, number one, is simply this: God is the source. Okay, we know that the Bible in the very beginning says that God created all things and that nothing can happen without Him. And God reminds them that He's a source, reminds His people that He's a source. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, if you turn with me, let's go ahead and read part of Deuteronomy chapter 8 together. Deuteronomy chapter 8, this is when they're getting ready to enter into the land, the children of Israel that have been taken out of bondage. God rescued them from bondage, and now Moses is giving them a recounting of their history. These are sort of like Moses' final sermons to God's people. And notice what he says here in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 11. He says, "Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments and His ordinances and His statutes, which I am commanding you today. Otherwise, when you have eaten and are satisfied, and have built good houses and lived in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out from the house of slavery. He led you through the great and terrible wilderness, with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water. He brought water for you out of the rock of flint. In the wilderness, he fed you manna, which your fathers did not know, that He might humble you, that He might test you, to do good for you in the end. Otherwise, you might say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who has given you the power to make wealth, that He may confirm His covenant, which He swore to your fathers, as it is to this day. It shall come about that if you ever forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you today that you will surely perish." See, God intended for them, when He provided this new home for them, to be prosperous. God intended for things to go well with them in their new home, but the warning was, do not forget the source. Notice God very explicitly is communicating that God is the one who gives you the power to make wealth. And so this is a reminder that wealth in itself has its own challenges and pitfalls. Because it's easy for someone who's become wealthy to forget about God and to become arrogant against God, as it says here, and say, it's by my own power that I've done this. That God had nothing to do with any of this. I knew a guy years ago, very successful business. He marketed these particular sauces to all of these stores all over New England, became very successful. And I remember talking to him one day. He was an unbeliever, but he said, I've been real successful, and God had nothing to do with any of this. He always was kind of getting those jabs in there because he was an unbeliever. But he failed to see that all of us live and move and have our being in Him. Nothing is possible without Him. And the text here is saying, do not be like that. Remember the story Jesus told in Luke chapter 12 about the man who became very successful in his business, and he was trying to figure out, what am I going to do? And he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to build bigger barns, and I'm going to store all of my wealth, and I'm going to retire early, and then I'm going to enjoy the fruits of my labor. And that's where the phrase, eat, drink, and be merry comes from. I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. And then that night, it was communicated to him that he was going to lose his life, and now what's going to happen? What good is all of this stuff now that he had stored up? Now, what was a problem with him? Was a problem that he was rich? A lot of people on the surface may think, well, the problem was he was rich. Well, the problem wasn't that he was rich. The problem is that he was not rich toward God. And that's what Jesus said at the end of the parable. He says, this is the way it is with those who are not rich toward God. He amassed a great amount of wealth, and what did he do with it? He hoarded it. He hoarded it. It was all about himself. His focus was completely on himself, and he wasn't rich toward God. So don't forget that God is the source. Number two, let's go to Proverbs chapter 3 for that. Proverbs chapter 3. And It's interesting, the book of Proverbs has a lot to say about our money and about our wealth. And I want you to notice here, Proverbs chapter 3. And let's start with verse 19 first. Let's go down to verse 19. All right, it says, "The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps were broken up, and the skies drip with dew." In other words, reaffirming once again, God is the source of all things, right? By his, verse 21, "My son, let them not vanish from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion." In other words, be wise as you consider all of these things. "So," verse 22, "they will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck, and you will walk securely in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble." Okay, wisdom, not money, will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck. Now, what does this have to do with our money? Back up to verse 7 of the chapter. Okay, it's talking about the value of wisdom. Verse 7 says, "Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil." In other words, don't say, "It's by my own power that I made my wealth and God had nothing to do with it." Goes on and says, "It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Honor the Lord from your" what? "From your wealth, and from the first of all your produce. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine." Honor the Lord from your wealth. That's an acknowledgement that the source is God. You remember the very first act of worship we have in the Scriptures? We have Cain and Abel. Both of them brought of their produce to the Lord because they honored the Lord. They understood that the source came from God. So honor the Lord from your wealth. And it says if you do that, the text reminds us that God will bless us richly. He'll continue to bless you. You know, the word for this is stewardship. And oftentimes we talk about stewardship. What is a steward? It's not a word that you hear too often anymore. But a steward, all a steward is someone who manages someone else's property, his money, or his affairs. A steward is not someone, by definition, not the owner, but he works for the owner to manage his affairs or his property. And the Bible reminds us in passages such as Haggai chapter 2 that all the silver and all the gold belongs to God. That's what God says. All the silver and all the gold belongs to me. And so everything that we do with what has been entrusted to us is to serve and to honor God. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 2, stewards must be found trustworthy. In other words, faithful. They serve their master's purposes faithfully. Jesus said in Luke chapter 12 that the faithful and sensible steward is one who works hard, not only when the master is there, but even when the master is away, even when the master isn't looking, the servant and the steward still works faithfully. Because a steward recognizes that he's been entrusted with what doesn't belong to him. Everything ultimately belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So we are God's stewards. We've been bought with a price. Not even we belong to our own selves. Therefore, we're to honor God with everything, including our wealth. Now, how do we do this wisely? Third point is just to take some practical steps to make the most of the money that has been entrusted to us. And the first one is simply this: live within the margin. How to make the most of your money? Live within the margin. Let me give you an illustration of what I mean by that. How many of you, when you go someplace and you have an appointment, try to be right on time? Does any of you try to be right on time? Now, if you try to be right on time, okay, so your appointment, say, is at 2 o'clock and you want to arrive right at 2 o'clock. What often happens when you try to arrive right at 2 o'clock? You're late, right? You spend 15 minutes hurrying to be 5 minutes late, right? But if you give yourselves a little bit of a margin and you're early, then if you're early, you're not what? you're not late. So if you're early, then you're not late. And that's what I mean by a margin. Give yourselves a margin. The same thing is true with money. I know it's tempting, especially when you're young and you've got all this money, and you think about all the things you're going to do with it. You want to spend it all. But leave a margin, leave some left over. And when you do that, over time, it begins to add up. You know, Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 11 says, when good things increase, those who consume them increase. In other words, you make a little more, put it away rather than keep and then increasing your spending. Because the question it asks after that is, what advantage is there in all this? You know, basically there's three kinds of people. There are the type of people who live on less than what they make. There are the type of people that live on exactly what they make. And there are the type of people who live on more than what they make. And we know that doesn't last very long, does it, if you try to live on more than what you make. And if you try to live on exactly what you make, usually, what do people usually say? There's more month than there is a paycheck. And so leave yourselves a margin. Plan to live on less than you make. That's a margin. Number two, simply, this is real simple. Don't spend what you don't have. Don't spend what you don't have. Okay? That's like the same thing as saying have a margin, okay? Because it adds up after a while. Because what winds up happening if you wind up come up short all the time, you know what some people do, and maybe you've done this before. Where can I get a little extra money? You know, there are some places that will pay me for my bodily fluid. I can go and they call it donating plasma, but they pay you for plasma. Has anyone ever done that before? You really need money, so you go down and you give a little plasma, and they pay you a little bit of money for that. You can only do that, I can't remember, once every 3 weeks or something. So some people will do that. Some people will take their stuff and put it into the pawn shop, and they'll get a loan. And I've known some people that put a whole bunch of stuff in the pawn shop, and it seems like all of their money goes into making pawn shop payments so they don't lose their stuff that's being held in collateral. Some people even go get title loans. You know what the interest rate is if you were to add up on a lot of title loans? I mean, we're talking like 300% interest. And some people have rightly said that that's an immoral practice. Exodus chapter 22. You know, I think this actually kind of touches on practices such as that. But Exodus chapter 22 and verse 25. Listen to what God says to his people here. He says, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. I sometimes wonder how that would apply to title loans when you seize a car from someone who needs it. But, you know, it's interesting, the word interest here in Hebrew, when it says charge no interest to the poor and do not keep his cloak, do not charge any interest, the word interest is from the Hebrew word neshek. And neshek, if you say that as a verb, neshak, it means to bite off. If you sit down and you take a big old bite of meat, you would use the word neshak. And so basically what we have here is a word picture. Charging interest is taking a bite out of someone. Okay, and what this means, when we say don't spend what you don't have, we're saying don't get yourself involved in a situation where you wind up having a bite taken out of you, because sometimes you may never get it back. I remember when I was growing up, I used to complain to my dad that we didn't have a lot of the things that a lot of other people had. I remember we didn't grow up with cable television when a lot of other people had cable television. We didn't have some of the same game decks, and even our cars were never new. And part of the reason I didn't realize till much later, my dad made it a point to avoid buying things on credit as much as possible. If he could pay cash for something, he would rather do that. The only exception he ever made was his mortgage payment. And so as a matter of principle, he avoided, in fact, I remember at one point he cut up all his credit cards. He did keep one for emergency purposes, but he cut up all his credit cards because he says, I don't want to buy anything now and have to pay for it later. And he must have learned a lesson earlier in life on that, like so many of us have. He didn't want to have a bite taken out of him. There's some wise principles here in scriptures concerning that. I want to go ahead and read to you from Proverbs chapter 6. And listen to what it says here. Proverbs chapter 6. It says, "My son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, and have given a pledge for a stranger, if you have been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, do this, my son, and deliver yourself. Since you have come into the hand of your neighbor, go humble yourself and importune your neighbor. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler." And so it's saying, if you wind up getting yourself into debt, do everything you can to get out of debt as quickly as possible. And I think we can even go so far as to say to try and avoid debt. Debt, I don't believe, was intended to be a means of making a living. And although some people do that, and I'm not going to mention our government or other people, but anyway, debt is not intended to be a means of living. And that brings us to the next point. Not only don't spend what you don't have, but save and plan. Notice what goes on to say here in the passage in Proverbs 6. After this it says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise, which having no chief, officer, or ruler prepares her food in the summer, gathers her provision in the harvest. And how long will you lie down, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and your poverty will come in like a vagabond, and your need like an armed man." And so here's an ant who spends all the time working and working hard and laboring, but also saving for the future. I think the Bible affirms here the idea of saving for the future. This is called financial planning. And when we talk about financial planning, we also talk about having a budget. And this is something that we can do if we live in the margin, and it adds up over time. And in the long run, it becomes a great blessing. When a need arises, you have the ability to fill that need. When the need arises from somebody else, you have the ability to share. And when the time comes, you have the ability and can afford to retire. And the only pitfall to this is when saving becomes hoarding. And I know some people ask the question, what is the difference between saving and hoarding? I mean, to some people they look the same, saving and hoarding. But really, what is the difference between saving and hoarding? Because we know the Bible condemns one and confirms and condones the other. I think part of it has to do with an attitude. Because a hoarder is someone who will not part with anything, with any money. Even when a need arises, they will hoard it and they won't part with anything. And part of it has to do with the attitude and with a lack of faith. I think saving for the future is an act of faith, where hoarding is an act of a lack of faith. Those who save and don't hoard are willing to take care of needs as they arise. And that brings us to the next point. Be willing to share to the glory of God. Listen to these words from Paul from 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning with verse 17. He says, "Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited, or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed." So if you have something, be willing to be generous, be willing to share, be rich in good works. And it says when you do that, not only you're storing up or you're saving for the future. And we're talking about eternally. You're saving up for eternity when you do that. Paul says a similar thing in Ephesians chapter 4 when he says to work with your hands what is good, so that you will have something to share with those in need. So working hard, making money, Saving, being financially successful with the right opportunities, enables people to do good when the opportunities arise. You know, one of the things I think about is I knew a retired school teacher when we lived in Arkansas, Glenna Garner, and everybody in town knew her. And I remember I went out with her one afternoon, and we had lunch. She was talking about her experience since she's retired, and she told me, you know, it's been a blessing to be able to retire. She says, there's a lot of things I'm able to do now that I wasn't able to do when I was still working. But she said, you know, I've been a lot more busy since I've retired than I was before I retired. But she says, I'm busy doing all the things that I want to do rather than just the things that I have to do. And so she was involved in a lot of things and a lot of good things, and that was a great blessing for her and for the people that she knew. Some people take their retirement and they'll join sojourners. They'll go and get some sort of camper or RV, and they'll go around the country and they'll help work with churches or with summer camps, or they'll do missions and help with construction projects and things of that nature. I remember I was thinking about all this, Alton Howard, and some of you probably have heard of him before, Howard Publishing, where our songbooks come from. But he was a man who was independently wealthy, and they said that he had the gift of making money. And with all of his financial prudence and his wisdom and his saving, he was involved in a lot of good works over his lifetime. And I didn't realize how many until I started reading about him. He was instrumental in starting World Radio. He was a founding member of the Whites Ferry Road Church of Christ. He started a summer camp and a lot of other outreach ministries. People at the Whites Ferry Road Church said, you know, if you got a startup that you're trying to get started and don't know where to find the money, go bug Alton Howard, because he was known for his generosity. So be willing to be generous and willing to share to the glory of God. And then finally, probably the most important thing is simply this: be content. Be content. Listen to these words, 1 Timothy chapter 6, further up the chapter. Last part of verse 5, it says that there are those who suppose that godliness is a means of great gain. But in the next verse, verse 6 says, but godliness is actually a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. We've taken nothing into the world, and we can't take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. You know, I think that's probably the greatest kind of wealth that anyone could have. Because there are some people that are wealthy, and by our standards, that are anything but content. And even in all their wealth, they can't find happiness or misery. Can't find happiness, and sometimes they find themselves in misery. The greatest kind of wealth is the contentment that comes from God. We understand that He provides the things that we need, and through Him we can have the correct perspective on life, and to understand that life is more than food and the body is more than clothing, and we really don't need a lot to be content. Proverbs chapter 30 says, give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me my portion. I can do all of this through Christ who strengthens me, and the contentment that comes from Christ. And this is probably the most significant way we can make the most of the resources that God has given to us. You know, God has not hoarded anything, has He? He's given more than anyone would have ever expected. He's given what is most precious to Him for us. He gave His one and only Son, Jesus Christ. And I don't think any of us can even imagine how much that cost was to Him. But He gave it willingly so that we can be reunited with Him, so that we can serve Him and worship Him and love Him. He gave the very best for us. And what can we do except to give the very best to Him? We belong to Him. And we honor Him, not only from our wealth, but from our whole being. And since He gave such a great cost for us, He's made it very simple for us to come to Him. It's not complicated. He tells us He wants us to accept that Jesus Christ died for our sins, to accept Him as our ruler, the ruler in our life, as our Lord. He wants us to repent and to follow Him. He wants us to be baptized. He wants to wash away all of our sins in our baptism and to walk with Him. Not very complicated. And once we've done that, then we become God's stewards. We belong to Him, and we make the most of all of the resources that God has given to us, realizing that it all belongs actually to Him. We're going to go ahead and sing a song this morning, and if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, please come as we stand and sing.